Frank, when you remount this movement into your clock case or cabinet, you're going to want to make sure that you have two things set properly on the pendulum. The first thing is that the time between tick and tock, tick tock, that needs to be an even amount of time between the two, left and right. And if it's not, the way you're going to adjust that is in following. This rod right here, if I pull that rod out, push the pendulum back a little bit so the rod can be pulled out forward, that rod goes up and comes up through the back, and that rod is actually attached right here. And so that rod is what's driving, or the pendulum pushes that rod and it drives the pallet forks excuse me, the pallet forks back and forth to do the tick-tock. So if you don't have an even amount of time after you pull this rod out, like I've done here, I'm going to move this rod by hand left and right. So now it's to left. You can see the pallet bottoming out there. Now I'll go all the way to the right with the rod. We'll go the other way, and you see it come back. Now the left hand side is engaged. Alright, so that's the tick-tock. What you have to do is, in holding on to this rod, you have to push it all the way till it stops because you've bottomed out, and then push it a little bit farther. So you're actually bending this rod, and so that if the rod is in one particular position, you're actually causing it to then be slightly off one way, or if you bend it the other way, you're repositioning that rod, and what that's doing is it's changing the angle on these pallet forks. And so what you do is take that rod, go to one direction till it stops, and then go like a ½ inch to an inch more, force it. You're actually slightly bending the rod. It is very soft and does bend. You're not going to damage it. But then try it again and see if the time between tick-tock has gotten better or worse. And if there's no change at all, then you need to bend it a little bit more. But if you hear that the amount of time between tick and tock is getting worse, then you're bending in the wrong direction. Go back the other way. And you're just going to have to tinker with it, fiddle with it, until you get it just right. It is important that the amount of time between tick and tock be as close as possible. If you can't tell the difference, then you've probably got it adjusted pretty good. Now the second thing you want to do is when you reinsert this rod into the slot, like I'm going to do right here. All right. Yeah, missed it. There we go. Come on, there you go. Gets in there. Now right here where this 90-degree bend is, I'm pointing to, that 90-degree bend right there, when it is inserted in the slot, you want to be able to see that 90-degree bend and at rest, just sitting here like this. You want there to be just a little bit of space where you could maybe get like a business card or maybe even the tip of a pencil in there. You don't want this rod to be buried down into that slot, because if it is, then that's going to take away a little bit of power. And you might also notice when this rocks back and forth, it may have a very slight twisting motion to it. So my point again is that you want this rod, the 90-degree bend, to be just out slightly so that just the horizontal is going through that slot. And so the rod, when I'm shipping this to you, is out and exposed, and it could get bent. So that's why you just want to check those two adjustments, and if you need to, you can bend that rod backwards and make sure that that 90-degree bend isn't buried down into that slot. Two more quick notes. This is the back side of the movement. Pendulum hangs right here, and this is that rod with the 90-degree bend. So you want this 90-degree bend to be just slightly outside of the slot in the pendulum. However, you don't want this bent so far back that you're hitting this back rail. So right now I've got just a little bit of room here, and the pallet can pivot back and forth without this rod touching anything, either on the pendulum or on this back side. And then the final thing was, as I told you in the invoice, your spring had broken. So this is the very innermost part of that spring, or the spring on the left hand side, and it mounts with a slot that's in there. Can't really see it. Maybe there is, see this, there's a little slot ground in there, and so yeah, it busted. I had to actually heat it up with a torch and anneal it, as it's called, so that it would be soft enough for me to regrind that slot in it, and then that slot is what holds on to the barrel arbor, as it's called. The arbor goes through, and that the inside of the spring has to grab onto that arbor on a hook. So all that had to be redone by hand, because this is where you broke, at the very most inner, coil and a half of this spring. And so, as I said in my invoice, if we work on this clock again, if it's years from now, please remind me that I've replaced, or I've done this modification to this spring on the left hand side. This spring has already been reworked once. If this spring were to break again, I don't want to try to do it anymore. I want to buy a spare mechanism, an old mechanism that we can take apart, use for parts, and I'll use the spring out of there. So that's one thing. And then the last thing is, we had this gear remade, and so the escapement wheel is new. However, he made the escapement wheel to the specs of the one that I had sent him, and that wheel is slightly a smaller diameter. This is working fine, but I know that the diameter of this wheel is a little different. And also the pallet forks, the very tip, the guy that redid this for us, he reground those. So my point is, the pallet's been modified. Even though this gear is good, seems to be working fine, it's not the correct original diameter. It's just a couple thousandths, like maybe 50,000 smaller diameter. But my point to all of that is, if I ever have to work on this clock for you in the future, I want to replace that escapement wheel, that pallet, and that spring with all original ones that have never been touched. So please remind me of that if you contact me in the future. All right? Again, have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. For more information, visit GameRoomRepair.com.